Let's do it. Good evening, everyone, and a very warm welcome to St James's Piccadilly for this Wren 300 lecture. This evening's talk is part of the Square Mile Church's Wren 300 programme, supported by the National Heritage Lottery Fund and other funders such as Tony Hales, former chairman of the Old Royal Naval College, who is here tonight. So thank you very much to all those who have made tonight possible. This year, the City Churches and Diocese of London have created a series of cultural and conservation-based activities that celebrate Sir Christopher Ren and examine his significance and impact on our heritage over 3 centuries. St James's is really delighted to be playing our part in this anniversary by hosting this event. And as we do so, I can't possibly let this audience remain unaware that St James's has just launched our own Wren project to raise a mere £20 million to restore and rejuvenate this church, courtyard and garden, which includes reinstating the door that Christopher Ren designed in this church in that wall there, which is on the axis with St James's Square. But to tonight's activities, it's my honour to introduce our first speaker to you. Neil MacGregor is one of the most influential figures in the cultural life of the United Kingdom today, and in many ways needs no introduction at all. Formerly director of both the British Museum and the National Gallery, and founding director of the Humboldt Forum in Berlin. His public role as a broadcaster has been hugely influential, with radio series such as The History of the World in 100 Objects, Living with the Gods, and The Museums That Make Us. I personally have had the great privilege of making some radio programs with him, which have not been only informative and inspiring, but really great fun. To introduce our lecturer tonight, please welcome Neil MacGregor.
Thank you, Lucy, for that very generous introduction and for the invitation here tonight. You're really here, of course, to hear William Whyte talk about Wren. But I just want to say a little bit about why I think we need to think about Wren now and why Wren really matters. Because I think one can say that there are really 2 Christopher Wrens. There's the Christopher Ren of St. Paul's Cathedral, which is an almost unique phenomenon of one architect building a whole cathedral. I can't think of any other architect for the 20th century who saw a cathedral right through from start to finish. And that is an amazing achievement. He kept his idea of what he wanted that church to be. And it was to be, of course, comparable with St. Peter's in Rome. It was to be the Protestant answer to St. Peter's in the style that was completely aware of what was happening in continental Europe, in France and in Italy, and would show that the Church of England was in every way the successor, the true version of the Christian faith here. The aesthetic determination that he showed to carry that through was wonderful, and no less wonderful were the devious tactics with which he achieved it. And Lucy will forgive me when I say the main problem was, of course, the clergy. And Wren was brilliant about this, I mean, absolutely brilliant. The key thing, I think, about Wren, and why I so admire him, having tried to run public institutions, is that he realized the great thing was to have jolly conversations with no minutes. And then you could announce what had been agreed. And this was a tactic he did brilliantly with the king. He would go and see the king, Charles II, and then come away and say the king agreed that. And it was very hard for anyone to disagree. And this let him keep complete control of the plan. The clergy thought he was building one church. He knew he was building another. By the time they discovered it was too late. Brilliant things like ensuring that you dug out the foundations for the whole of the cathedral as planned and started building at several different points simultaneously, so that you didn't have that terrible problem that when the money ran out, the clergy would say, well, we'll just have 2 bays in the nave and not 6. It was impossible. He made it all happen at colossal expense over 40 years. An amazing achievement. And we were just saying earlier that if only HS2 had had Christopher Ren, it would happen. And nobody would quite know how. And we'd all be amazed. And ultimately, we'd all be very grateful. That's one Christopher Ren. But the Christopher Ren that William Whyte is going to talk about tonight is the Christopher Ren of the parish churches. And that's, I think, very fascinating, a completely different Christopher Ren, because there you can't possibly say there's an aesthetic. Every church has its own view, its own tradition, its own history. Every church has sometimes a bit of an old building, or as here, no building at all. Every church has a particularly difficult set of church wardens, sometimes a city livery company as a funder, always parishioners who know exactly what ought to happen. And all this, of course, has to be negotiated in every parish. And to do this, there's an enormous, enormous office of young architects, but not just architects, all the trades and the skills that go with making the building in stone and in wood and in plaster and in glass, everything. He manages the office, this great range of skilled craftsmen, and he has a brilliant eye for talent and develops them. He manages every single group of church authorities, dealing with parish by parish, and sorting out what they need, what they want. And again, this time, most of the negotiations take place in pubs or coffee houses. Everyone has a very jolly time, and then the next day, Wren tells them what they decided. And no one can quite remember whether that was what they decided, but he did it. And the range, you know, this is what William's going to talk about, the range that emerges. He's unique, I think. I can't think of another architect of equal distinction who can create something like St. Paul's Cathedral, who can work in so many different styles. He can build a faux Gothic, St. Mary Aldermary, and he can do the most serious Roman classical in St. Stephen Walbrook. I don't know any other architect who can work across styles, across time, the way Wren can, and always because that's what the people wanted. And that's what I want to finish on for today, because what Wren is doing is something, I think, of enormous ambition. We're all brought up knowing that the fire of London destroys the city and that the city and the churches have to be rebuilt. And that, of course, is absolutely true. But in 1667, the year after the fire, everybody involved in making any Wren church or anything in London had lived through the most astonishing set of experiences. They had seen the king executed, the Archbishop of Canterbury executed, they'd seen Cromwell, they'd seen the king come back, and they knew that nothing could ever be the same again. And what Wren knew was, what everybody knew, was that you must never allow disagreements again to reach the stage where you can have a civil war, in which religion played a major part. That was the most important thing. Everybody had been through that experience. And the city that Wren is making these churches for is a new kind of city. And he's making, I think, uniquely, Wren is building not for the new city, he's building for a new society. Everything about the power relationships in England had changed between 1649 and 1667. London and the new commercial class in London have an authority they didn't have before. The Protestant end of the Church of England and the Catholic end realize they have to come to an accommodation. The Jews have been allowed back into England after 300 years by Cromwell. There's a big and growing Jewish population. There's a very large nonconformist population. And there's also, increasingly, a population from the new colonies in America. The London of the 1660s is the biggest city in Western Europe. It's just overtaken Paris. We're about 600,000 people. The biggest city in Europe is still, of course, Istanbul, Constantinople. But by far the biggest city now is London. And it's the city that has connections across the world because of shipping, as no other country, as no other town. And that's a new London. This is not the London in which the churches before the Civil War had existed. So Wren's building a new society. He's creating spaces where the citizens can establish a new relationship, not just with God, but with each other. Because that's the key thing. We mustn't get back to civil war. And all these spaces, and this is the one he thought was the finest. Here there were no constraints of old foundations, new site, quite a lot of money, and this wonderful generous church, which remains the model for Wren admirers for several centuries until today. He's building these spaces with a civic purpose as well as a religious purpose. And that's why they're different in the different places, because you have to accommodate what the different parishes want. And the diversity, the variety, the mixing of the old and the new is exactly what you find if you read the preface of the 1662 prayer book. Because the Church of England, just at the same time as Wren, of course, has to think, what are we now after an archbishop has been executed, after the established church has been abolished, without a bishop of London for decades? All of this has got to be rethought. And how you mix the old, the new, and how you embrace, particularly, the people who have normally felt excluded. And just one point there, if you think in the 1662 prayer book, the new service introduced is that for baptism for those of riper years. This is not a new sensitivity to ageism in the Church of England. It's the fact that a large part of your population have been Anabaptists, people who believe that you should only be baptized as a consenting adult, and they've got to be given a form. But also, and it says quite specifically, because there will be people converted in our plantations in the New World. And we have to have a service that will allow them to be brought in. So from the beginning, the idea of the slaves and the indigenous Americans in the plantations being part of the story and having to be included in the liturgy is part of the new thinking of this new city, which is why, of course, the recent artistic developments here are so important to affirm that long tradition of a truly global version of the liturgy for the Church of England, for a country engaged with the whole world. And finally, Wren will tell you that he'll keep everybody happy, all the church wardens will smile, ultimately the priest will smile, the congregation will be delighted, and then he says, but what about the money? And amazingly, he says, if you look at the continent of Europe, you will find that those communities run by begging monks, managed to put up magnificent buildings. I will help you, he says, with the art of begging. He's going to take on the fundraising. So Lucy would, I'm sure, welcome him here tonight, that if anybody has 7 million to spare, this is the moment. But if you don't, Wren would have gone round and found it for you. To talk about all this amazing man who changes our city and the way the church lives in the city and the way the city lives in the church, there couldn't be a better person than William Whyte. William Whyte, who has the chair of architectural history in Oxford, is also, as well as being an Oxford professor, a clergyman, so an ordained priest in the Church of England, so has that wonderfully Trollopian title of the Reverend Professor William Whyte. But his great work academically has been to show how buildings interact with society, affect society, and how society then affects the buildings, and how the way we talk about our buildings, think about them, tell us about the kind of society we are, but even more important, about the kind of society that we want to be and want to become, because buildings help us become the society that we choose to be. That's what Wren in the parish churches, I think, is about, how you can use architecture to let us become the citizens that we want to be, saints as citizens in these new spaces. So please welcome Reverend Professor William Whyte to talk about that. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you ever so much. That's extremely kind. Thank you all very much for coming on a Friday evening. It's extremely decent of you to do so. What I'm going to be talking about, as you just heard, is Wren's church building practice. So those of you who are hoping to hear about St. Paul's, I'll mention it, but it's not going to form the central feature of my talk, because if one looks, and here in Charles Cockerell's vision of Wren's work of 1842, one sees everything dominated by St. Paul's. But of course, in addition to Greenwich Hospital, Chelsea Hospital, the various other secular buildings that Wren was responsible for, Wren has the oversight, though not necessarily the direct design, of at least 52 churches in London, 2 chapels, 3 chapels in Cambridge, 1 chapel possibly in Oxford, and a variety of other ecclesiastical buildings. And Cockerell includes some things that Wren had no responsibility for at all. But let's ignore that deviation from the truth and focus instead upon what it is that Wren is most famous for, and the thing that I'm going to try and persuade you tells us most, not just about his practice as an architect, but also his beliefs as a person. Because Wren is not merely an architect, and not merely, as you just heard, a great public servant. Wren is a man who was born and raised within the Church of England, a man who experienced the Civil War and the interregnum as the child of the Church of England. Wren's family was one in which the church was not simply important, in which the church was absolutely central to his life. His father, Christopher Ren Sr., a man destined only really in history to be remembered as the father of Christopher Ren, was in his own life a significant figure. He was the Dean of Windsor, which meant that he was a central figure in Charles I's reconceptualization of the church, and a figure of significant patronage and importance until in the 1640s, all that ended with the advent of the Civil War. Wren's uncle was a still more significant figure. Matthew Wren, Bishop of Norwich and then of Ely, was a man who had risen within the Church of England, and his younger brother, Christopher, had followed beyond. He was a man who was a major patron within the church. He was the patron, not least, of Peterhouse, where he was responsible for the building of that chapel in Cambridge, and after the Civil War, in the Restoration, he was the patron of the chapel at Pembroke College. He's also somebody, weirdly, that I can't find a picture of, except as a very young man, which is not at all a useful one for you. But he's a figure of enormous significance, and the Wren family are part of that generation of men who emerge into royal service, who emerge into clerical service, who are the great supporters of Archbishop William Laud, who, as you just heard, goes on to have his head chopped off, great supporters, great subjects of the patronage of Lancelot Andrewes, involved in that process whereby in the 1640s, 1630s, the High Church in the Church of England is not just interested in absolute conformity to the prayer book and an assertion of the importance of episcopacy and an emphasis on the significance of the royal power within the Church of England, but a moment in which they're also seeking to explore what becomes known as the beauty of holiness. They're seeking to understand how something which they feel had been lost at the Reformation could be recovered. A sense of order and of decency, certainly, but also a sense of mystery, a sense of beauty in worship. That's the world in which Christopher Ren was brought up. And it's almost certainly the case that had it not been for the Civil War, had it not been for the interregnum, a civil war which saw his father expelled from the deanery of Windsor and forced to shelter, ejected from his parishes in Bletchington, just to the north of Oxford, an interregnum which saw his uncle, Matthew, imprisoned in the Tower of London for 18 years. Had it not been for those events, it's almost certain that Wren, who's the only surviving male son of his father, would have become a cleric, would have moved on in uninterrupted progress to become a bishop, perhaps even Archbishop of Canterbury. But that ends, that prospect, that future ends for Wren, and instead he goes on to enter Oxford at 17, to be educated at Wadham College in Oxford, to become a proficient mathematician, the great genius, as John Evelyn describes him, of mathematics and astronomy, who goes on to become Gresham Professor of Astronomy, who goes on, of course, to enter public service, not as a cleric, but as an architect. So Wren is born and brought up within the church. He's born and brought up within a particular part of the church, within that high church, monarchist section of the church, which is going to be under the most pressure, under the most attack in the Civil War and in the interregnum. And Wren is almost certainly sympathetic, at any rate, to that upbringing. He lives, more or less, he's brought up as a sickly young man. He's brought up at home, educated by his father. He has a brief period at Westminster School, but until he's 17, he's essentially living within that bubble of royalist, loyalist, high church Anglicanism. And he has that to build on, as in the 1660s and then onwards he goes on to build churches. But Wren's own views are something of a puzzle, quite where Wren's position on religion, indeed where Wren's position on most matters of public life, and indeed Wren's position on something as personal as his own faith, that we have very little sense of, and indeed we have a number of disagreements. If one looks at the great works on Wren, the works on which I've drawn in order to think about this talk, we can see that there are multiple different Wrens. The two Wrens that Neil was talking about, Wren, this visionary architect of St. Paul, and Wren, this effective, efficient public servant. But there's also, of course, Wren the scientist. We can understand Christopher Ren as being an unremitting experimentalist. At Wadham, as a student at the age of 17, he'd encountered the circle around William Wilkins. He'd encountered the circle that was going to go on to create the Royal Society. He's part of that Enlightenment world, that English Enlightenment world of experiment and mathematical investigation. Perhaps, if that's true, we should understand Wren's churches as being the expression not of an active faith, not of somebody who has any particular ecclesiastical or religious interest, but rather as somebody who's engaged in a set of mathematical problems, a set of experiments. Or perhaps we might, as Matthew Walker has argued in his book and in recent articles very brilliantly, we should understand Wren preeminently as a public servant, as a figure in the Restoration who is, as you just heard, seeking to rebuild civil society, seeking to rebuild politics, seeking to rebuild the state which had been lost at the Civil War and Restoration. And again, what that would suggest is that his churches, just like the rest of his architectural practice, is essentially bureaucratic, essentially to do with the construction of a new kind of restoration state. Or perhaps we should understand him as a significant religious figure. Lisa Jardine, in her great biography of Wren, describes him, and I quote, as somebody with intense religious fervour, somebody who had a strong emotional connection to the high church Anglicanism of his father, of his uncle, of his family more generally. Perhaps we should look at Wren's churches as being the expression of that intense religious fervour. Or should we conclude with Adrian Tinniswood in his great biography of Wren that in fact what we are looking at is somebody who has no firm religious commitments at all, who is more or less willing to build what anybody will pay him to build. So Wren is a puzzle. And that puzzle of Wren, that puzzle of who he is and what he believes and what relationship any of that has to do with the architecture that he actually goes on to create, that puzzle is made all the more problematic by the fact that the Wren that we read about is a Wren who has been filtered through several generations of myth-making. The first set of myth-making was the myth-making of his own family, of his son and grandson, whose account of parentalia, of the history of the family of Wrens, presents us with a figure who's essentially a great public statesman and who has no real personal beliefs whatsoever. The next moment, the next really significant moment, which filters Wren for us, is my favourite period, and that's the period of the Victorians, because the Victorians hated Wren. They loathed him. They thought he was essentially inept. They thought he was dishonest. They thought he was a liar. I could spend half an hour explaining to you why the Victorians looked at St. Paul's and looked at it as a building that was not merely ugly, but was actually immoral. I'm not going to bore you with that now, but it's really striking that whereas Charles Cockerell in 1842 presents this vision of Wren, the heroic architect and creator of modern London, a year later, Augustus Pugin presents us in 1843 with his vision of the present revival of Christian architecture. Being Pugin, what the present revival of Christian architecture amounts to is Pugin's work, reproduced over and over again. But the extent to which the Victorians adopted Pugin's understanding, which is that this is Christian architecture because it's Gothic architecture, and this is essentially pagan architecture because it's classical architecture. That set of assumptions is something that we've wrestled with ever since Pugin published it, and ever since the what was known in the 1840s as the Rabbes Gothicorum, the Gothic rabies, the Gothic rage, overturned all of Wren's achievements and made us question whether what he was building was Christian architecture at all. So I'm trying to then do two things. The first is I'm going to try and tell you something about what Wren was doing. And then the second, and this is a much more dangerous thing to do, particularly on a Friday evening after a glass of Prosecco, but I'm going to try it anyway, is what I'm going to try and do is to explore whether what Wren was doing could answer the questions that I began with. To what extent do Wren's churches tell us something about Wren? And in more particularly, to what extent can they tell us something about Wren's understanding of religion, whether religion as a public good or faith, religion as a personal, private matter? And so there are four things I want to talk to you about over the next 20, 25 minutes, as it were. I want to think about Wren as a practical man, exactly what we began with, that question of Wren as a practical figure, essentially trying to solve a set of particular problems through his church architecture. I want to think too about how this fits into Wren as a political figure, not just Wren as a public servant, although one of Wren's extraordinary achievements, which is not remarked upon often enough, is the fact that he survives. He is appointed by Charles II. He continues under James II. The Glorious Revolution has almost no effect whatsoever upon his career, and he continues under William and Mary, under Queen Anne. And it's really only with the advent of the Hanoverians and with the fact that Wren, by that stage, is so aged that his career, his 50-year career as an architect, comes to an end. But I also want to think what Wren thought churches did politically, because his experience and the experience of his society was that it was almost impossible to separate the religious from the political, because both were the subject of debate. I want to think too about what he thought churches were for, what was the worship that he was designing these churches for. And then I want to speculate towards the end, by which point I hope those of you inclined to quarrel with me will have fallen asleep, and those of you who are inclined to agree with me will just be nodding quietly. I want to speculate a little bit about whether or not we can discern from the designs that he's producing a personal understanding, which is related to his experiments, related to his experience as a politician, as a public servant, related to his understanding of what the Church of England is and how the Church of England worships, but also might tell us something about his own understanding of faith. So let's begin with the practical element of this. Let's think about who Wren was and what the practice of his life was. Wren, born and bred almost certainly for the church, has to find another avocation in the interregnum. As he enters Wadham College, Oxford, in the 1650s, he is understood as a genius, he's understood as an extraordinary mathematician, he's a figure who is supported by people like William Wilkins, the warden of his college, who is another great survivor. Wilkins is a parliamentarian. He's married to Oliver Cromwell's sister, and yet after the Restoration, Wilkins becomes the Bishop of Rochester and the Master of Trinity College, Cambridge. These are practical men. These are men who put thought, These are men who put reason. These are men who, above all, put mathematics and the experimental sciences above mere party, political, or religious disagreements. And it's worth bearing in mind that Wren is responsible for building all these churches, for overseeing all these churches, not really because he's regarded as a great expert on the church, not really because he's even regarded as a great expert on architecture. He's barely built anything by the point that he's made the architect responsible for 52 churches in the City of London. He's put in charge of those things because he's a surveyor, because he's an expert in measurement. He's an expert in the process of calculation. And he approaches that question of how, in the aftermath of the Great Fire of London of 1666, he approaches the question of how you reconstruct London as a surveyor above all else. Within days of the fire, he has famously joined those other people who have attempted to redesign London completely, attempting to rationalize, attempting to stabilize, attempting to modernize the ancient street patterns of London, with straight streets, with grid patterns, with axial views, with central buildings that are going to provide the focus and the organizing principles of a new and modernized City of London. Failing in that, as he does fail in that famously, what he's left with is the process of drawing up the measurements and determining the scale, the size, and the basic body of the church that's going to be built. And he's responsible too, as a practical man, as we just heard, for dealing with each and every one of the individual parishes. It's one of the things, again, that we probably don't talk enough about when we talk about Wren as a visionary genius, is precisely that question of Wren as a practical figure, and also a figure who is often on the make. The order in which these parishes get to build these churches, using public money, of course, using the money, the coal tax, is determined by two key features. The first is how much can those parishes themselves contribute to the building of these churches. What happens is that because the coal tax money takes years to come in, those parishes who can offer more money get priority in the queue to build. It's almost a bit like a private finance initiative, except without the crippling debt. What happens is that these are churches that, if you can pay, you get your way. And even more important than whether you can pay is whether you can pay Christopher Ren himself. All of the church wardens' accounts of those churches that are early to build show small but significant gifts to Sir Christopher. Sometimes no more than a pair of gloves or a sack of malmsey, sometimes significant sums of money. So Wren is not above making money out of this process. He's a practical man. And if we look at how he approaches these churches, we can see that what he does is a series of experiments in how you can build a church. So what we end up with is a series of different plans. Some of the churches are simply reconstructed on the existing foundations. Where there's walls that are still standing, those walls can also be reused. In other cases, what we see is a series of different ways in which you can build a church, whether it's St. Stephen's Walbrook, where he has additional sums so he can build a bigger church and experiment with how you're going to do that, whether it's an attempt, as at St. Bennet Fink, to try and squeeze a church onto a difficult island site, whether it's St. Bride's in Fleet Street, where you can see, again, what he attempts to do, again on a different site, is not just to build the church, but also to introduce galleries, and to do so in a sensible, orderly way, so that you can fit and maximize the number of parishioners sitting in it, or whether, again, where here at St. Swithin Cannon Street, where you reuse the reuse the existing foundations where you squeeze everything into a very constricted site and you maximize the availability of space with the creation of this octagonal dome. What we can see is there is a fundamentally practical, experimental approach. If we were to review all of the 52 different churches that Wren oversaw in the aftermath of the fire, what we would find is no one church is like any of the others. There are types, there are square churches, octagonal churches, there are churches that predominate in an axial direction, churches that maximize central planning. There are churches that use different styles. There are churches with galleries and churches without. What we see is not unlike Wren's practice as a scientist. A lot of his church design is simply experimenting with finding different forms. And if that's true, then that also explains some of the ways in which it's difficult to make sense of Wren, and some of the ways in which the Victorians hated Wren. They hated him because there wasn't a single style, because there wasn't an apparently single approach. But to dislike Wren for that, or to condemn Wren for that, is to ignore the fact that the principles he was working on were fundamentally different from those of subsequent generations. What Wren was trying to do was to work his way to provide the right solution for the right place at the right price. This is a fundamentally practical business. And one of the things he has to take account of in making the right church in the right place for the right price, of course, is for the right purpose. Because, of course, these are all churches which are being designed to fulfill a particular function. These are all prayer book churches. In 1662, as you know, the Church of England had agreed, or at any rate had imposed, a standard form of worship on the church. This is what Laud had sought to enforce across the whole of England and Scotland before his fall in the 1630s. And this is what, in England at any rate, the high church, royalist Anglicans sought to impose on the Church of England in the aftermath of the Restoration. It would lead to the expulsion of those people who dissented from the prayer book, and the dissenters, that dissenting tradition, would grow in significance and importance throughout Wren's life, and of course would grow on to become the basis for the nonconformist community, which becomes such an important figure in the 18th and 19th centuries. And Wren is charged, as he builds these churches, with enforcing the basic norms of the Book of Common Prayer. And I think it's extremely significant that the frontispiece is a classical reredos, really. What it is a book imposing order using the classical orders. And Wren adopts that. There were three key elements to the Book of Common Prayer's worship. Two sacraments, that was the critical thing. This is a Protestant text. The sacrament of communion and the sacrament of baptism, the dominical sacraments, as they're sometimes expressed. And then there's another element, a really critical element of Anglican worship, and that is preaching. And so what one finds is that the organizing principles of all these churches are designed to ensure an altar, and it's critical that this is an altar. One of the great arguments between Wren's father's generation, between Matthew Wren, between Christopher Ren Sr. and those people we now call Puritans, was about whether communion was celebrated around an altar or around a table. Whether it was in some ways a reminiscence of the sacrifice, or whether it was merely a recreation of the Last Supper. The Book of Common Prayer makes it clear that this is an altar, that the altar has to be hedged, has to be fenced round and kept separate, that it must have a fair white cloth upon it. And so if we look, there is always a special place for that altar at usually the east end, but certainly in a separate, set-apart place. There is always a special place for the pulpit. And Wren's pulpits are amongst the most interesting and important features of the churches. Much taller than this. This is really a pathetic thing in grand scheme of things. Much taller, often a triple-decker pulpit surmounted by a sounding board in order to maximize the sound. And then, of course, a baptistry, a place. And if you look at the back of the church here, you see the great font of Grinling Gibbons's work here, a font everywhere else. So what you've got is you've got an intensely practical response to an ideological text, to the Book of Common Prayer, an attempt to impose common worship throughout the Church of England, in every church in the land. And Wren produces, as it were, a machine for praying in as much as anything else. This is a program driven by that. And if one looks, St. James Piccadilly is the great example, at least in Wren's mind, of precisely that, in which we have, in the recreation, the post-war recreation of it, in which we have this great altar, we have the Grinling Gibbons carving to establish its significance, in which we would have had a taller, pulpit, in which we would have had almost certainly the baptistry at the back. And in that way, what you can see is Wren, throughout his work, is attempting to build something that fits that Laudian worship, whether it's at St. Stephen Walbrook, St. Mary Walbrook, whether it's at St. Catherine Cree, whether it's at the other churches. Although there is a degree of flexibility, a degree of freedom, nonetheless, the basic model, the basic working assumption is 1662 worship. St. Mary Ab Church, it's St. Mary Ab Church. And in 1711, when the Tory ministry of Queen Anne passes an act of parliament to build 50 more churches, 50 churches to combat the growth of dissent in London, these great churches like Christ Church, Spitalfields, like St. Luke's Old Street, like St. Anne's Limehouse in the middle, Wren is called upon to be a commissioner for that great church rebuilding program. He's called upon to give his opinion as to what churches should be like. And again, and this is how we know this church is so significant, because Wren says that this should be the model church for those 50 new churches. And he says it should be the model church for a very interesting reason, because he sees it as a model church for the Church of England's worship. What you have here, he says, is a building perfectly designed to listen in. And that for Wren is the critical point. He says Catholics, Romanists he called them, Romanists need only hear the mere murmur of the Mass. That's how he describes Roman Catholic worship. He says, however, Protestants, we Protestants, he said, need to be able to hear what is being said. So our churches, he writes, are better fitted as auditories. That's what the church is for. We have a church with an altar, we have a church with a baptistry, but above all, we have a church with a pulpit. These are spaces that are meant to come alive when people speak. And so Wren says that St. James's Piccadilly achieves that perfectly. He says the human voice can only really carry as far as this space. He says 60 foot by 90 foot will enable you with galleries to seat 2,000 people. Totally convinced that health and safety would enable us now to sit 2,000 people, but nonetheless, This was, he said, the ideal space in order to create an auditory. And why was it an auditory? It was an auditory because that was what the Book of Prayer intended it to be. A place where you could hear the priest celebrating communion, where you could hear the priest conducting baptism, above all, a place where you could hear the priest reading the prayers from the 1662 Book of Common Prayer. And although the 50 churches plan of 1711 is a total failure, only 12 of them are ever built, it nonetheless, the lessons that Wren teaches are the lessons that go out. And so if one looks at St. Martin's in the Field, for example, you can see James Gibbs, a Catholic, interestingly enough, nonetheless learning the lesson that Wren has taught here. And so St. James's Piccadilly and St. Martin's in the Field between them become the model church that goes out across the empire, creating Anglican worship wherever they go. And so Wren, when he experiments, is experimenting in his church design with the ideal of achieving a particular outcome. He's not just experimenting for the sake of it, he's experimenting in the hope of creating a place that is liturgically appropriate, that it fulfills the needs of the Anglican Church as it was recreated in the aftermath of the Restoration, as it is embodied in the teachings of the 1662 prayer book. And that is linked not just to a religious program, it's linked also, of course, to a political program. Almost Wren's first ever building was not a church. It was the Sheldonian Theatre in Oxford. And at the opening of the Sheldonian Theatre, there is a tremendous celebration of this great work which is painted on the ceiling of the theatre. It opened in 1669, and the public orator, celebrating the work of Robert Streeter, the great court architect who paints that, begins his celebration with the immortal lines, "Future ages must confess they owe to Streeter more than Michelangelo." It has to be said that future ages have tended not to agree with that basic assumption. But it's a really important painting nonetheless. It depicts truth descending upon the arts and sciences and expelling envy, rapine, and ignorance. And here is ignorance, or possibly rapine, being expelled from the courts of learning. What it's meant to depict, indeed what the whole Sheldonian theatre is meant to express, is the triumph of the Restoration monarchy, of the Restoration Church, and of course, because it's in Oxford, of the Restoration University, over all those forces who had brought about civil war in the 1640s and the interregnum in the 1650s. And so, envy, rapine, and ignorance are not just personifications of these particular evils, they are also personifications of dissenters, of free thinkers, of republicans, of all the people that were blamed for the overthrow of church, state, and monarchy. And churches are, just like the Sheldonian, intended to embody that too. Some places this is more obvious. Here is Hawksmoor's St. George's, Bloomsbury, which is an extraordinary building which attempts to recreate the mausoleum of Halicarnassus, but to improve it with the addition of a lion, a unicorn, and a statue of King George on top of it. But it's not unique in that respect. The prayer book, the canons of the Church of England, required the royal coat of arms to be placed in every single one of the churches. And Wren is responsible for that process of ensuring that these are not just buildings that celebrate and provide a proper background for proper prayer book worship, but these are also places where the head of the Church of England, where the monarchy, where the state is celebrated too. Here on the screen of St. Peter Cornhill, you can see that even here, where you've got something which is an attempt to reintroduce a pre-Reformation practice next to this extraordinary pulpit. I mean, doesn't this seem trivial in comparison to to what could have been, what once was. But nonetheless, surmounting all of this are the lion and the unicorn of England and Scotland and the coat of arms of the monarch. These are political buildings as much as they are religious buildings. Indeed, for the age in which Wren is building, there is no difference between religion and politics. That was the great lesson of the Civil War, and that is also the lesson which has been learnt at the Restoration. And that symbolism of monarchy and church, of church and state, is also, of course, a civic symbolism too. Just like New York in the 20th century, London is famous for its towers. And those are the towers of the churches that Wren rebuilds. And those are, each of them, symbols of the individual parishes that build them, but they're also, of course, symbols of the nation as a whole, of the achievement of England as a whole. And it all comes together if we go to another of Wren's secular buildings, which nonetheless symbolizes and celebrates a religious achievement. This is the Great Wall of Greenwich Hospital, painted by Thornhill, and celebrating the apotheosis of the Hanoverians, which is why you've got a series of overfed monarchs sitting at the top of the stairs. Unfortunately, porcine, but nonetheless distinctively royal. And in what they are is celebrating the Hanoverian monarchy, celebrating the achievement of the English state, and celebrating St. Paul's Cathedral. Already by the 1720s, 1710s, 1720s, Wren's work has become symbolic of the nation as a whole. And so what we can see in Wren's work, in his churches, in his cathedrals, in fact, actually we can see it in his secular buildings too, is the fusing together of these three forces. Wren, the experimentalist, determined to try and test things in order to achieve the best result. Wren, the child of the church. Wren, the person building a church that will fulfill the needs of the Anglican church as by law established in the aftermath of 1662. And Wren building churches that are also symbolizing, celebrating, and solidifying the state and the relationship in particular between church and state. And so as one walks round Wren's churches as they stand today, we are dropped back into that period of experimental science, of Restoration Church, and of the Restoration monarchy. But all of that might have happened anyway. Wren's not the only architect of these buildings. Hooke is building churches too. There are other people working with Wren on these buildings. Wren is working, as we've heard, with the vestry, the church wardens, the patrons, the livery companies, all of these people. And he's working too in response to the demands of the commissioners who are overseeing all this. Can we, from these churches, get any sense of what Wren himself actually thinks and believes? Well, I think we can to a certain extent, and I think we can by again going back and seeing where Wren comes from in order to think about where Wren ends up. Wren's father, as I say, was an important figure in the court of Charles I. He was a follower of Lancelot Andrew. He had been a fellow of St. John's College, Oxford, and therefore was connected to William Laud. Wren's uncle, Matthew, is an even more significant figure, and a figure who suffers more as a result, who is imprisoned for the best part of 2 decades by the parliamentarians, and who then emerges into power and prosperity at the Restoration too. This is the world that Wren comes from. So what do they believe about the church? Well, we can get a sense of that by what his uncle and his father actually built in the years of Wren's youth. Here's Peterhouse College Chapel, which is a joint production between Matthew Wren and William Cosson, who goes on to become Bishop of Durham. This is a building which is consecrated in 1634, and Matthew Wren preaches a sermon at it. It's a building that in the Civil War is going to become symbolic of everything that's wrong and bad about the Laudians, everything that's wrong and bad about the High Church Anglicans. And it's wrong and bad because it reintroduces stained glass windows, because it hedges the altar behind a fence, because you approach the altar up these stairs. Everything about it is unconducive to Puritan worship, and everything about it is conducive to the worship of High Church Anglicanism. And at the consecration in 1634, Matthew Wren preaches a sermon based upon Jacob's dream, the moment where Jacob in Genesis falls asleep, sees angels rising and falling up a ladder, wrestles with God, and then wakes up, anoints the stone he's been sleeping on, says, "Truly God was in this place and I knew it not," and calls the place Beth-El, the home of God, and therefore provides a type of the temple and provides an image, a justification for the idea of sanctifying holy space. Wren's father is the vicar of East Knoll in Wiltshire, and 5 years later, in 1639, pays for all this plasterwork, which shows a small figure of Wren Senior praying to God, an everyman figure, but more than anything, more interesting than that, shows on the east wall in plaster the ladder of Jacob's dream, taking the angels up to heaven and bringing them back down to heaven. It's an image that was seen as significant. In 1646, Wren Senior, Christopher Ren Senior, writes to the church wardens and says, "In the current circumstances, I imagine these are regarded as somewhat scandalous. Could you cover them up, please?" And he's right, because iconoclasts, because figures from Parliament arrive and describe them as superstitious rubbish, evidence of the fact that Wren Senior is a figure of unmitigated High Church Anglicanism. Wren, in other words, comes from a background that doesn't think about churches as important in general, but thinks about them as important in particular, and sees them in particular as somehow linked to that story of Genesis, to that story of Jacob sanctifying space in honor of God, setting up a stone that's going to become the archetype of the temple itself. And I think if we look at Wren, and we look at what Wren is actually building in his churches, we can see that he's not just following a program of experiment, he's not just producing a building that will be suitable for prayer book worship. He's not just fulfilling a political program. I think there are at least two other things that he's doing which draw upon that family inheritance. One is metaphysical, and one is historical. The metaphysical element is perhaps most obvious in church buildings like St. Stephen Walbrook. St. Stephen Walbrook is one of the most magical and important of Wren's buildings. It's a really remarkable church which manages at one and the same time to maintain a kind of axial cruciform shape whilst also producing a kind of centralized plan. It's a building which produces a special place for the altar, a special place for the pulpit, a special place for the baptistry, and to surmount it all with this soaring dome. Above all else, what it does is embody that ideal that Wren has, that these are mathematical experiments, that these are ways in which he can experiment with how maths can solve the problems that he's got. And I think that's really significant, because for Wren, maths is not just a set of abstract ideas. For Wren, maths is not simply a way of playing with numbers. For Wren, and he makes this very, very clear in his inaugural lecture as Gresham Professor of Astronomy in 1657, for Wren mathematics are, and I quote, the only truths that can sink into the mind of man, void of all uncertainty. For Wren, in other words, maths are a way of conveying fundamental truths, truths which are, in some respects, religious as much as they are scientific. And the notion of the dome, I think, is hugely important here. Because what the dome does, and it's clear, very clear in the way he designs the dome of St. Paul's, but it's also clear in this experiment in preparation for it, that what the dome does is not simply surmount the church in interesting ways. What the dome does is to make visible mathematical ideals. It makes visible the catenary curves of Hooke's law. It makes visible the forces of nature acting upon the building. It makes visible those mathematical truths which are the only way, in Wren's words, to sink into the mind of man, void of all uncertainty. And that is linked to a historical understanding too. In designing St. Stephen's Walbrook, in designing all these churches with their altars set apart, in designing all these places, what Wren is attempting to do is to rebuild the temple. He's rebuilding the temple after a period in which the temple has been desecrated. He's rebuilding a temple. In this case, in St. Stephen's, it's very clear that what he's attempting to do is to rebuild Hagia Sophia, which he believes is an attempt to recreate the temple. And Wren writes about that. He writes about the fact that it was, as he puts it, the stubbornness of the Jews, their commitment to the temple, which had held the nation together for thousands of years. He's attempting to do that through his designs, which are rebuilding the temple which has been desecrated. And we can see how this is symbolized in the columns. We can see how this is symbolized in the domes that he used. We can see that what Wren is attempting to do is not just to build buildings that work, he's building buildings that communicate, and buildings that communicate often subliminally. In other words, what Wren is doing, it seems to me, and as I say, I hope those of you who disagree are now asleep, but those who are still with me, what Wren is doing is building fundamentally practically, but for him the practical includes the theological. For him, the practical includes communicating in just the way his father had done, in just the way his uncle had done, in just the way the Book of Common Prayer suggests you should. So Wren, in other words, is attempting to unite mathematics and antiquarianism, attempting to unite science and theology, attempting to unite church and state, attempting to unite the metaphysical and the historical in buildings like this. The problem is that speaks for a particular moment, and by the 19th century, none of those assumptions are accepted. All of them are under threat. And so the Wren that we now read is somebody who has been misunderstood, not least because my Victorians have taught us to misunderstand him. But that is another story, and you've sat here patiently enough, so I'll stop. Thank you very much. Is it all right? I'm sorry.
Thank you, William. I think you can all see why we are so uniquely fortunate tonight, void of all uncertainty, that this is the man that we needed to hear to understand Christopher Ren through the filter of the Victorians on whom William Whyte has written so powerfully. And there's a little time for questions. We know what to think about the pulpit, so no questions about that. I notice that every single person is still wide awake, and I hope some of you sufficiently in disagreement to ask some testing questions. So, questions to William. And there's a roving mic there, for a hand at the back. Could you put your hand up, please, and the mic will come. Thank you.
Hi, Professor Whyte. Can you tell us a little about this church, as in what makes this the model church?
Oh, yes, of course. No, that's a very good question. So why for Wren is this the model church? I think in part it's the model church, and, Neil gave a hint to that, is that this is, unlike almost all the other churches that Wren gets to build, this is a church that's built on a greenfield site. So almost all the other churches, Wren is confined by the fact that he's building them in places that he fundamentally doesn't want to be building them. So Wren, as I said, in the immediate aftermath of the Great Fire, comes up with, he's one of half a dozen people who comes up with a plan to rebuild London, which is going to be rational and sensible and mathematical and ordered, and he fails, he fails largely, because the British don't like that, the English don't like it. It's essentially NIMBYism and an inability to override existing property rights. So he's left rebuilding churches on sites that he wouldn't choose, often with less space than he'd want to, quite frequently reusing. He's very, very sensible at reusing the existing foundations and even existing walls when they're still there. And in fact, if one looks around the churches, you can see how cleverly he integrates that. And also, how that even means, and this is something we mentioned right at the start, that even means that he changes the style that he's going to use. So it's one of the things, if you look at those places where he's reusing stuff, sometimes he'll use a Gothic form, because there's enough standing to do that. If there's slightly less standing, he'll use often the Tuscan order, which he clearly regards as essentially Gothic. And if you see his work on churches where he's restoring, then, he is willing, as he puts it, to deviate from a better style and use other ones to do that. Whereas here, what he has is he has space, he has a prospect to the road, which he doesn't often have, and he has the opportunity to build something that's spacious enough to fulfill his purposes. And that spaciousness also means that he can provide separate areas for the different liturgical functions. I think there are two other reasons that are important. One of them is, to go back to a point I made, is that for Wren, and I think for most late 17th and 18th century architects, in many respects, acoustics are key. It is about hearing. These are, as Wren puts it, these are auditory churches. And so they are designed so that the human voice can project into them. And that's why the pulpits were high, that's why they had these sounding boards above them, that's why you get plaster, that's why you have all of these things. And so here is a space that he believes, whatever it is, 60 by 90 foot, which is the space that can be filled by the human voice. By a single person preaching can fill that in this space. I think the third reason is another practical reason, which is that in order to achieve that, what Wren does, of course, is to introduce galleries into the church. And this is another thing the Victorians hate. The Victorians hate galleries beyond all measure. They mainly hate galleries because they think people misbehave in galleries. There's a widespread belief in the 1830s that you would be able to reduce the illegitimacy rate in London if you get rid of galleries. There's a very strong belief that these are bad spaces. But for Wren, of course, maximizing the acoustic effect, if you have a gallery, and particularly if you have a high pulpit, that means you can preach to the gallery, literally preach to the gallery at the same level. And this is how do you do that? How do you integrate a gallery into an architectural space? And I mean, the reason that if we go back to Gibbs's work, the reason his is so influential is because he is exploring that. How do you introduce a gallery into a space? Well, for Gibbs, what you do is you do it on a giant order column, and you just pretend that the gallery just fits into it. Here, of course, what Wren is doing is something similar. I mean, this is a restored version, but nonetheless, you get the idea, is that what you do is you treat the gallery as though it is the base level of a new order. How do you integrate the gallery in? Well, what you do is you treat it as though it's another vessel. Whereas for Wren, of course, what he does is he has these arches that then relate to the windows and bring it in. So for Wren, I think it's a solution to a series of problems that are made possible. That solution is made possible by the freedom that a greenfield site gives him, if that makes sense. Yes.
At the front. Thank you.
One thing you've left out in all this is music.
Yes.
The organ and singing. What was Wren's approach to that?
Well, that's a really good question. So what does Wren think about music? Wren says almost nothing about music, it has to be said. And indeed, in most churches, I mean, the working assumption is that there is very little singing. It's a spoken service with perhaps occasional chanting of psalms as much as anything else. But you know, one of the things that Wren's approach does, and you can see how it achieves it here, is that the gallery also provides you the opportunity to provide a space for the organ. Or if not for the organ, it provides a space for the Western Gallery singers to be there, which is what becomes increasingly popular. And again, the Victorians really dislike what Wren does, because what Wren tends to do is to carry you have a space set aside for the preacher and the clerk who are the reading. So this is why you have these triple-decker pulpits which are designed, in which you have the parish clerk sitting at one level, then you have a reading desk at another, and then you have the preaching desk at the top. But there is no space for a choir. And so one of the things that happens in the 19th century, even in churches that don't look as though this has happened, so even if one goes, not a Wren church, but one of the subsequent churches, go to St. George's Hanover Square nearby, and that looks like it's essentially untouched, but Arthur Bloomfield got in and got rid of a whole load of pews in order to provide space for a choir. So Wren doesn't actually provide separate space, except when a church can afford to put an organ in. And that's because, again, it's mainly the spoken rather than the sung word that's being celebrated here.
Yes, lady here in the third row. Thank you.
Thank you. It's really interesting. I have two questions, and they're both unreasonable.
Oh,
and
good.
They both arise because I grew up in physics. Mm-hmm. One is that Wren obviously was an astronomer, eventually Astronomer Royal, and I wonder if you know, was he any good?
As an astronomer?
Did he discover anything? I've never heard of anything that he discovered. Yes. I wonder if you happen to know. And the second question is because, of course, every medieval Gothic church or cathedral that you still see, was built before Newton and anybody articulated how gravity works. Yes. But you talked about Wren doing experiments with his architecture, and of course Wren lived through the period when his buddy, Isaac Newton, articulated how gravity works and how you resolve forces, which makes it considerably easier to figure out how the roof, for example, is going to stay up. And so I wonder whether you see any change in his architecture, or anybody else's architecture for that matter, that happens because that gets articulated during his lifestyle. I mean, it was also kind of a byproduct of the plague, right? Whether that really makes any difference in how his work functions.
No, they're not at all unreasonable questions. They're perfectly reasonable questions. Is Wren a good astronomer? Wren suffers from being brilliant at lots of different things without necessarily becoming a leading figure in any one of them. So Wren is churning out ideas in the 1650s, 1660s as a leading figure in what becomes the Royal Society. So Wren is at 15, he's become an expert in how you produce, sundials, which is something that people are, he's known for that. At Wadham, he famously creates a glass beehive, so you can watch actually how bees work. And this becomes the moment where they discover, not least, not through Wren, but through other finds, to everyone's tremendous shock, they discover that the beehive is not run by the king bee, that in fact it's a queen bee who's doing all the work, which rather changes people's views of apiariculture. He is involved in, the accurate mapping of the surface of the moon, but he's not looked back on as a major figure in astronomy in terms of discovering things. There's a really good lecture by my colleague on Wren as an astronomer online at the Gresham College thing, which will provide huge amounts of information on that. His great interest is mathematical measurement, hence the sundials, hence the other stuff. In terms of whether science is changing how he does things, it does to the extent. There are three maybe really important things. One is that he is trying to work out how sound works, because he's completely wrong in how he thinks sound works. He thinks sound somehow moves through the air around us. He doesn't have a sense of sound waves operating. He has a sense of sound a bit like heat diffusing through the air, which is one of the reasons why, if you look at his designs, all the pulpits have high backings behind them, because he has a belief that the voice of the preacher will almost radiate circumferentially from his speech, and therefore it needs to be pushed forward. But he has a real interest in his real interest is engineering in some respects, and so the Sheldonian, very interesting design, because the Sheldonian is not just a theatre for performance, it's also a printing press. So it's the first home of Oxford University Press, with all the printing going on in the basement and the compositors working behind the seats in the Sheldonian, and all the papers stored above that great ceiling that I showed you. And it is this ceiling. So, and it is until the 19th century the broadest unsupported span in Europe. And Wren produces a very, very complicated interlocking system. It's almost like a dome in some respects, interlocking system of trusses that enable them to support the tons of weight of paper that's above it, which again he publishes in the Proceedings of the Royal Society, the Transactions of the Royal Society, as evidence of that. And yeah, there is an influence. So as I say, Hooke's work on catenary curves has a real influence on how he goes about designing the supports for his domes. So he designs them, and you can see that if you trace not just the supports but also the foundations for them, that these are derived directly from Hooke's law. So in that sense, he is learning from other scientists, and it's having an effect on his practice.
I think we have time for one more question, and then yes, at the back.
Thank you. So his pupil Hawksmoor had a lot of esoteric and Masonic references. Did that come out of the blue, or was Wren in that sphere as well? I believe that a lot of mathematics was sort of secret information for these groups.
It's a very good question. I mean, Hawksmoor is a really interesting figure because he is Wren's pupil, and in some respects he's engaged in he's not a scientist, not a mathematician in the same way, but he is in some respects involved in the same kind of conjectural archaeology. So if Wren is very, very interested in rebuilding the temple. That's a driving force in trying to work out what the temple looked like and how it worked. Hawksmoor is really, really interested, not least, in how the basilicas of the ancient Christians, as he described them, were built. And so amongst Hawksmoor's overarching assumptions in his buildings, built as part of that 50 New Churches campaign, he is interested in how you build a distinctive Anglican church that gets you back to the early church. The great competition is between the dissenters who argue that they're like the early church and the Church of England that has to make the claim that in fact it's in continuity with the early church. And so one of the reasons you get in Hawksmoor all these Roman references. So what you have here at St. George's, Bloomsbury, is the mausoleum of Halicarnassus, topped off by a Roman altar, topped off by a statue of George II. The reason you have that, the reason you have all this stuff, like at St. Alfred's, Greenwich, is that what Hawksmoor says is, how would the early Christians have worked? Well, they would have been reusing the basilicas of the Romans, and they will have reused the spolia of the fall of Rome in order to generate their things. So there's that. Was Wren a Mason is a whole other question. Wren was almost certainly a member of something like a Masonic lodge. But what effect that had and what that actually meant is far from clear. And it's certainly not been shown to have any great, it's very hard to read from, basic Masonic principles anything very significant in Wren's design. But it's an area of research that continues because people would love to show that, in fact, this is all Freemasonry. And they haven't yet. We had I remember a wonderful seminar I organized on whether Wren was a Freemason. And it was suddenly the seminar room was entirely full of people I'd never seen before. And I said, how did you find out? And one of them just said, oh no, we always find out. But even that wasn't able to show that there was anything distinctively Masonic about his work. Anyway, I should stop.
Thank you. I'm afraid this is the moment at which we have to stop. But what we have found out is that you have given us the most wonderful introduction to this man that we want to know more and more and more about, this inexhaustible genius. And you've allowed us to think about him differently, and above all, think about this place differently, and the place it has in Wren's thinking and what Wren was trying to do. So thank you very, very much, all of you, for coming,
yes,
for your questions, and Lucy for allowing us to be here. And above all, can we all thank once again William Whyte. Thank you for a wonderful...
Thank you. That's really kind. Thank you. Thank you for coming.